Cora Halloran dropped her 2 carpetbags on the dirt, looked the rancher dead in the eye, and said the one thing a desperate woman was never supposed to say. "I know you want to send me back. Don't." Wesley Tate hadn't spoken a single word yet. Neither had the 15 men standing behind him. She didn't flinch, didn't apologize, didn't lower her eyes the way women do when they know the room has already decided against them. She just stood there, a widow, a mother, 31 years old, and completely out of options, and waited for him to be brave enough to hear her out. If this story already has your heart, subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The stagecoach had already turned around. Cora watched it go, the dust rising slow and indifferent behind the wheels, and she understood exactly what that meant. There was no going back to Amarillo. There was no going back to anything. The last $2 she owned were folded inside her left boot, and her daughter Nora was pressing her small face against Cora's hip, like the child already understood that this moment was the kind that split a life in two. Wesley Tate stood 6 feet and 2 inches of weathered silence. His hat was pushed back just far enough that Cora could see his eyes, and his eyes were doing the kind of math that men do when they realize the situation isn't what they ordered. He looked at Cora. He looked at Nora. He looked at the 2 carpetbags. Then he looked back at Cora, and she saw it. That particular expression. The one that meant I sent for a cook, not a family. She'd seen that expression before. She knew exactly where it led. So she spoke first. "I can read your face, Mr. Tate," she said. "And before you say what you're working up to say, just hear me out 60 seconds. One of the ranch hands behind Tate, a broad man with red in his beard, made a sound that was somewhere between a cough and a laugh. Wes didn't look at him. He kept his eyes on Cora. "Ma'am?" 60 seconds, she said again. Not hard, not pleading, just clear. He closed his mouth. She took that as permission. "My name is Cora Halloran. I am 31 years old. I cooked for railroad gangs in Kansas for 3 years, never less than 35 men, sometimes as many as 50. I can stretch a sack of flour and a half-barrel of beans into 3 days of full meals for a working crew. I know baking bread over open fire, cooking over a wood stove, and improvising when neither is available." She paused exactly 1 beat. "I am also a widow with a 6-year-old daughter, and yes, I should have mentioned Nora in my letter. I didn't. That was a mistake. I'm telling you now." Silence stretched out across the yard. A jay screamed somewhere off in the mesquite. The wind pushed a tin pail across the dirt near the barn door. Wes Tate looked at his daughter again. The little girl had turned her face up and was watching him with the kind of serious expression that 6-year-olds get when they're trying to understand if a strange man is dangerous or just unfriendly. "What's your name, little one?" Wes said. "Nora May Halloran," the child said. "My mama can cook anything. She made soup out of a fence post once." The red-bearded man actually laughed that time. He couldn't help it. Even Wes's jaw shifted, not quite a smile, but the territory right next to one. He looked at Cora. "A fence post. Railroad camp, 1879. We had a post in Onion and Creek Water." She met his gaze without blinking. The men ate 2 bowls each. Wes pulled a slow breath through his nose. He looked off toward the barn, then back at Cora. His expression had shifted by a few degrees, still uncertain, still guarded, but something underneath had moved. "The advertisement said cook," he said. "It didn't say." He stopped himself. Looked at Nora again. Chose different words. "It didn't say additional circumstances." "No," Cora agreed. "It didn't. That's my fault." He waited like he expected her to keep apologizing, to fill the silence with excuses and explanations, the way people do when they're afraid. She didn't. She stood in the quiet and let him sit with it. That, more than anything she'd said, seemed to land somewhere unexpected inside Wesley Tate. Because he tilted his head just slightly, the way a man does when something surprises him, and he said, "Where would the child stay?" Cora felt the breath move back into her lungs. "With me," she said. In whatever quarters come with the position. She won't be under your feet. She won't disturb the men. She knows how to work quietly, and she knows when to stay out of the way. She's 6, one of the hands said from behind Wes. This one was young with a sunburned neck and skeptical eyes. 6-year-olds don't know anything quietly. Tom, Wes said without turning around. Tom fell silent. Wes looked at Cora for another long moment. Then he made a sound, not agreement, not refusal, something in between. He stepped back and gestured toward the main house. Come in out of the sun, Anna. The kitchen at Roan Fork Ranch had seen better decades. Cora stood in the doorway and took it in without saying anything. A sensible woman takes the measure of a kitchen before she says a word about it, because what a kitchen looks like tells you everything about how a household has been running. This kitchen told her plenty. The wood stove had a warped door that wouldn't close flush. The work table was solid, at least oak-scarred from years of use, but the shelves above it held their inventory in a state of profound disorder. Flour in a sack that hadn't been tied properly. Cornmeal in a bucket with no lid. Coffee beans loose in a clay jar with a cracked rim. The cast iron was good. That was something. 3 heavy skillets on their hooks properly seasoned, which meant someone once cared about this kitchen, even if no one had lately. Previous cook left 3 weeks ago, Wes said from behind her. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed. We've been managing. Cora said. She walked to the stove, opened the warped door, looked inside. You have a proper flue. Yes. Firewood dry. Mostly. Sourdough starter. He paused. Had one. Might be gone by now. Where? He pointed to a crock on the far end of the lower shelf. It had a cloth tied over the top. Cora crossed the kitchen, lifted the cloth bent close, and smelled it. She straightened. It's not gone. It's tired. Give me 2 days. Wes watched her move through his kitchen the way a man watches someone handle something valuable, a good horse, a well-made rifle, to see if they know what they're doing. Every movement she made was efficient and direct. She opened things, smelled things, touched things with her fingertips. She wasn't performing. She was assessing. The men eat at 6 in the morning and 6 in the evening, he said. 16 men counting myself. Long days during working season. They need real food, Cora said, still moving around the kitchen. Not just volume. Hot, solid, and varied enough that they don't lose appetite from repetition. She turned and looked at him directly. I know how to feed working men, Mr. Tate. That's not the question. He straightened slightly against the doorframe. What is the question? The question, Cora said, is whether you'd like me to show you tonight, or whether you've already decided to put me back on the Monday stage. There it was again. That directness. Not rude, not aggressive, just stripped of all the social softening that people usually wrap their meaning in. Wes was quiet for a moment. He looked at Nora, who had crept into the kitchen and was standing next to her mother, with her hand wrapped around 2 of Cora's fingers, watching him with those serious gray eyes. I'll decide after supper, he said. That's all I'm asking, Cora said. The sleeping quarters attached to the cookhouse were small enough that Cora and Nora had to share a narrow cot, but the walls were solid, and there was a window that let in afternoon light. Cora had slept in far worse. She'd slept in a railroad tent with 8 other women during a Kansas winter. She'd slept in a wagon with Nora held against her chest for warmth after the fever had taken Daniel, and left them with almost nothing. A narrow cot with solid walls felt like something close to luxury. She settled Nora with a biscuit she'd found in the tin on the cookhouse shelf, stale but edible, and told her to stay put and be quiet while Mama worked. Nora said, Is the man going to let us stay? Cora said, I don't know yet. Nora thought about that. Then she said, I think he will. He looked at you like he was thinking real hard. Cora almost smiled. That's not always a good sign, baby. It is when people are thinking good things, Nora said, very certain. Cora pressed her lips together and went back into the kitchen. She had 4 hours before supper. She spent the first hour taking full inventory of everything in the cookhouse and the dry goods storage shed out back. She found 3 pounds of dried beans, a half sack of cornmeal, 1 good slab of salt pork wrapped in cloth, dried onions braided and hanging from a hook, a jar of lard that was still clean coffee, and in the back corner of the shed behind a broken barrel, a 10-pound sack of flour that hadn't been touched. She stood there in the shed with that flour sack in her hands and did the calculation in her head the way she always did. 16 men, 2 meals a day. What she had in front of her and what she could make from it. The math was hard, but it wasn't impossible. Hard and impossible were not the same thing. She had learned that the year Daniel died. She went back into the kitchen and started a fire. The first thing the men noticed was the smell. They came in from the corrals and the pastures at the end of the day, the way working men always come in, tired, dirty, ready to eat whatever was offered, and not inclined to think much about it. 2 of them were already complaining to each other about something involving a fence line. One was walking with a slight limp. Tom, the young one with the sunburned neck, came in first because he was closest to the door. He stopped dead in the cookhouse entryway. The man behind him walked into his back. "Tom, what?" "Something smells." Tom said. The man behind him said, "Like what?" Tom said slowly, "Like bread." That word moved through the group like a current. Men behind them craned their necks. Real bread, not the dense gummy soda bread their previous cook had produced. And not hardtack, but actual yeast-risen bread just out of the oven, the crust still cracking as it cooled. Plus bean stew with salt pork and dried onions, cooked low and long, until the beans had broken down to something rich and thick. Plus a pot of coffee that didn't smell burned. Men who've been eating poorly for 3 weeks respond to a good smell in a very particular way. They get quiet. They stop complaining. They stop pushing each other. They walk forward like they're being called. Cora stood at the stove with her back to the room and did not turn around when they came in. She ladled stew into bowls. She kept her movements even and unhurried. She had learned a long time ago that the kitchen was her territory, and how she held herself in it determined how the men would treat her in it. "Sit down," she said without turning around. "It's too hot to stand over your shoulders." A beat of silence. Then boots on the floorboards, the scrape of bench legs, men settling. Tom said from somewhere in the middle of the table, "Ma'am, is that sourdough? Cornbread?" Cora said. "Sourdough is 2 days off yet." Tom said, 2 days. She heard something in his voice, something that wasn't quite hope, but was in the neighborhood. She set the first bowl on the table and moved on. Wes Tate did not eat with the men. He came to the cookhouse doorway and stood there the way he had that afternoon watching. Cora felt him there before she saw him. Something about the way the room shifted slightly when he was present, the way the men's noise calibrated itself down a degree. She plated a bowl for him, walked to the doorway and held it out. He took it without a word and looked down at it for a moment. "You going to tell me what's in it?" he said. "Beans," she said. "Salt pork, onion, a little of the lard, cornbread on the side." She looked at him steadily. "Nothing fancy. What was available?" He took a bite of the stew. She watched his jaw work, watched his eyes go somewhere else for just a second, somewhere that wasn't the ranch, wasn't this moment, and then come back. "It's good," he said, like the word surprised him. "It's supper," she said. "Tomorrow it'll be better. After 2 days it'll be right." He looked at her for a long moment. "Why better?" "What changes, Char? The starter," she said. "Once it's fed and rested, I can do proper bread. And I'll need you to send someone to town for a few things, not much. Eggs if they have them. Salt. A pound of lard if your supply's low." He was quiet, still eating, looking at her over the bowl. "You already decided what you're making tomorrow," he said. "I decided on the ride out here," she said. "I always plan 3 days ahead." Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, not yet. But the doubt that had been sitting on his face since the moment she stepped off that stagecoach had moved, migrated somewhere less central. "You can stay the week," he said. "On trial." "The week," she said. "See how you manage the full crew, morning and evening both." He paused. "If it works." "It'll work," she said. He looked at her. She didn't say it the way people say things they're hoping are true. She said it the way people state facts they've already confirmed. Wes Tate ate the rest of his supper in the doorway and didn't say anything else. But when he was done, he handed her the bowl with something that was almost careful, like it was worth returning properly. "6 in the morning," he said. 16 men. "I'll be ready at 5, she said. He walked away into the dark. Inside the cookhouse, Tom was pulling his second piece of cornbread off the board when the man next to him, older with a gray mustache whose name Cora had already learned, was Dell, elbowed him. "She stays," Tom said low. "Trial week," Dell said, even lower. Tom looked at his cornbread, then at the pot of stew still steaming at the center of the table, then at the kitchen doorway where Cora had already gone back to the stove. "Hope she stays," he said. Dell said nothing, just nodded once. "Okay." That night after the men had gone, Cora washed the bowls herself. She didn't ask for help. She didn't expect any. She scraped the pot, checked the fire, covered the starter crock back up with its cloth, and put it somewhere the temperature would stay even. Nora had fallen asleep on the cot in the side room, tucked against the wall with her knees pulled up. Cora stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her daughter sleeping. She thought about Daniel. Not the sorrow of him, she'd done most of that work in the months after, but just the fact of him. The way he used to say that a woman who could cook like Cora could survive anything. "You were right," she thought. "I'm still here." She sat down on the bench at the work table and allowed herself exactly 5 minutes of stillness. 5 minutes was all she permitted herself. Grief was a luxury she could feel but couldn't afford to dwell in. After 5 minutes, she got up and started a list for the morning. She was at the stove before 4:30. The fire was going by 4:45. She had biscuits mixed and resting by 5, coffee measured out and waiting. At 5:50, Dell came through the door early. She learned later that Dell always came early, had done it for 15 years, and stopped when he smelled coffee already made. "Lord," he said. "Sit," Cora said. "It's fresh." He sat. She poured. He wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at the stove where biscuits were already browning in the cast-iron skillet. "Where'd you cook before this?" he said. "Kansas," she said. "Railroad." "That's hard country." "It is," she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. Then, 3 weeks of bad eating. "You don't know what this smells like." "I know exactly what it smells like," Cora said. She set a plate in front of him with 2 biscuits and a small pot of the sourwood honey she'd found tucked behind the broken barrel in the storage shed. "Eat before the rest of them get here. You were early. You've earned it." Dell looked at the plate. He looked at Cora. He was 62 years old and had worked cattle ranches his whole life, and he had a very particular expression on his face. Just then, not sentiment exactly, because men like Dell had long since packed most of their sentiment away, somewhere practical. But recognition. The recognition of someone who had been looked after properly. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, quietly. "Cora," she said. He nodded. "Cora." Tia. By the time Wes Tate came through the cookhouse door at 6:10, every seat at the long table was taken. 16 men eating hot biscuits and fried salt pork and drinking coffee that tasted like coffee was supposed to taste. Nobody was arguing. Nobody was complaining about the fence line or the weather or the price of beef. 16 men who had spent 3 weeks eating badly were just eating. The way people eat when food feels like it means something again. Wes stood in the doorway and looked at all of it. Then he looked at Cora. She was already at the stove, not looking at him, refilling the coffee pot from the water bucket. He pulled out the chair at the end of the table and sat down. Dell passed him the biscuit board without being asked. Tom passed him the salt pork before he could reach for it. Wes ate, and for the first time in 3 weeks, the morning at Roan Fork Ranch felt like it was beginning correctly. He didn't say a word about it, but when he stood up to leave and passed Cora on his way to the door, he stopped. "The starter," he said. She looked at him. "I'll send Tom to town for the eggs and lard this afternoon," he said. "Anything else you need, write it on a paper and give it to Dell." Then he picked up his hat from the peg and walked out into the morning. Cora turned back to the stove. Her hands were moving before the door had finished closing behind him. Already planning supper. Already thinking 3 days ahead the way she always did. But her shoulders, for the first time since the stagecoach had dropped her in that yard, were not quite so high. The week had started. She intended to make it count. The trial week was never supposed to be a test she could pass this fast. Wes Tate had told himself that Monday morning, standing outside the barn while the smell of real coffee drifted across the yard from the cookhouse. He'd told himself that one good breakfast didn't mean anything, that a woman who could feed 16 men well on day 1 might fall apart by day 4 when the supplies thinned and the men got particular and the stove threw heat unevenly in the afternoon wind. He'd told himself a lot of things. By Wednesday, he'd stopped telling himself most of them. It wasn't one thing. It was the accumulation, the way supper was never late, never thin, never the same 2 nights running. The way the coffee was always made before the first man came through the door in the morning. The way the cornbread on Tuesday had been different from the cornbread on Monday, slightly sweeter. And Tom had looked up mid-bite and said, "Did she change something?" And Dell had said, "Don't ask questions, just eat." The way Cora herself moved through the cookhouse without wasted motion, without drama, without ever once asking anyone for reassurance that she was doing it right. She didn't need reassurance. That was the thing that kept snagging at Wes when he wasn't paying attention to it snagging. Most people, most anyone who just arrived somewhere uncertain trying to prove themselves, they watched the room. They watched faces for approval. They adjusted themselves based on what they read back. Cora didn't do that. She cooked the way she was going to cook and let the food do the talking. It was Wednesday afternoon when the first real trouble came. His name was Garth Pickett, and he was the oldest hand on the ranch, 22 years on the payroll, which he used the way some men use a deed as proof of ownership over something that wasn't legally his. Garth was broad through the shoulders, slow to move, and possessed of opinions he expressed without particular concern for how they landed. He came into the cookhouse at the wrong time. Cora was in the middle of bread hands in dough the starter finally fed and lively after 2 days of patient work. Nora was sitting in the corner near the wood box on a small crate Cora had set up as her station, working through a spelling lesson Cora had written out for her on the back of a flour sack. Garth looked at the child. He looked at Cora. He leaned in the doorway the way men do when they want to fill up more space than they're actually occupying. "Nobody asked for a schoolroom in here," he said. Cora did not stop working the dough. "She's not in your way." "This is a working kitchen," Garth said. "Not a nursery." "Correct?" Cora said. "And I'm working in it. Is there something you needed, Mr. Pickett?" He didn't like that she knew his name. She'd made a point of learning all 16 names in the first 2 days she always did on any crew, and men like Garth generally preferred to remain anonymous to the help. "I needed coffee," he said. "That's it." "Pots on the stove," Cora said. "Cups on the shelf." He looked at her for a beat. Then at Nora, who had looked up from her spelling words and was watching him with those steady gray eyes. "She stare at everybody like that," Garth said. "Only people who come in loud," Nora said. The kitchen went very quiet. Cora pressed her lips together and kept her hands moving in the dough. Garth Pickett stared at a 6-year-old for a full 3 seconds. Then he made a sound somewhere between a snort and a laugh, poured his coffee, and left without another word. When the door was closed, Nora looked at her mother. "Was that wrong?" she said. "Probably," Cora said, "but not untrue." Nora considered this with the gravity only small children can bring to moral questions. Then she looked back at her spelling words. Cora exhaled through her nose and pressed the heel of her hand into the dough. She told herself Garth was manageable. Men like Garth were almost always manageable because their problem wasn't with her. Specifically, it was with change, with unfamiliar presence, with anything that disrupted the particular rhythm they'd settled into. Give him good food long enough, and he'd stop noticing she was there. That was the theory. The theory ran directly into reality on Thursday morning. Wes was in the barn when Dell came to find him. Dell didn't run. Dell hadn't run anywhere in 15 years, but he walked with the kind of deliberate speed that meant something needed attention. "Garth's in the cookhouse," Dell said. Wes looked up from the harness he was repairing. "Doing what?" "Telling her she doesn't belong here." Wes set the harness down. He came through the cookhouse door to find Garth standing on the kitchen side of the work table, which was a line nobody crossed, an unspoken boundary that every working cook on every ranch and railroad camp enforced without having to state it, and Cora standing on the other side of it with a cast iron skillet in her right hand and a completely level expression on her face. The skillet was not raised, it was simply being held, the way you hold something you know how to use. "Problem," Wes said, not a question. Garth turned. "I'm telling her straight. 22 years on this ranch, and I don't eat breakfast next to a child. It's not right. It's not how a ranch runs." "Nora eats at the small table," Cora said without inflection. "She has since Monday. She doesn't sit with the crew. She's still in the room." "Garth." Wes's voice was quiet, which the men of Roan Fork Ranch all knew was the version of Wes's voice you did not argue with. Garth stopped. "She's cooking," Wes said. "You're eating. That's the arrangement." He looked at the man steadily. "You got a problem with the food?" "A beat." "No." "You got a problem with the coffee?" Garth's jaw tightened. "No." "Then we're done with this conversation," Wes said. Garth looked at Cora, then he looked at Wes. Then he walked out. The door closed behind him. Wes looked at Cora. She had set the skillet back on its hook with the careful precision of someone who'd been very controlled about the whole thing. Her face was neutral. Her shoulders were straight. "You all right?" Wes said. "Fine," she said. She turned back to the stove. He watched her for a moment. "Cora." She looked at him over her shoulder. "I'm sorry about that," he said. Something moved through her face, not exactly surprise, but something adjacent to it. Like she hadn't expected the apology and wasn't sure what to do with it. "It's not your fault," she said. "It's my ranch," he said. "Which makes it my fault." He paused. "I'll talk to him properly tonight." She turned back to the stove. But he caught at the smallest shift in her posture. Not softening exactly, but an adjustment. Like something that had been held very tightly had released one careful degree. "Breakfast is in 40 minutes. She said. He went back to the barn. That evening, after Garth had received whatever quiet conversation Wes delivered, because he came to supper with less of his usual sprawl and ate without comment, something else happened that Wes had not anticipated. Tom brought Nora a book. It appeared on the small table where the child ate her meals, a battered McGuffey reader, the kind that had been through several sets of hands, and Tom dropped it there with the studied casualness of someone who has decided to do a kind thing but doesn't want to be caught being sentimental about it. Nora picked it up. "Is this for me?" "Found it in the bunkhouse," Tom said. "Nobody's using it." Cora at the stove heard the whole exchange. She said nothing. But she looked at Tom just once quickly, and Tom, who was 24 years old and had left home at 16, and hadn't been looked at quite like that by a woman since, went slightly red in the neck and sat down very fast. Dell next to him said nothing. But there was something in the set of his mouth that in a younger man would have been a smile. By Friday, the last official day of the trial week, something had settled over Roan Fork Ranch that was hard to name but impossible to ignore. The cookhouse was different. Not the building was the same warped stove and scarred oak table it had always been. But the room felt occupied differently. Like a space that had been going through the motions had suddenly remembered its purpose. Men came to meals earlier than they needed to. That was the first sign. Working men who'd spent 3 weeks coming to the table like it was an obligation now arrived a few minutes before the bell, not rushing, just drifting that direction, the way people drift toward warmth. They stayed longer afterward, too. Not long. Working men on a cattle ranch don't have time to linger, but long enough. An extra cup of coffee. A second biscuit wrapped in cloth to carry back to the barn. Small negotiations with Cora about whether there was anything left in the pot conducted in the respectful tone men use when they know the answer depends on the mood of the person they're asking. Cora was not soft about it. She wasn't a pushover with the provisions, and she never would be. Waste and indulgence were enemies she'd fought her entire working life. But she had a sense for who'd worked the hardest that day, and who'd eaten properly and who hadn't, and the extra biscuit tended to land in the right hand. The men noticed. They didn't say anything about it, because men like this don't narrate what they observe. They just noticed. Friday supper was the sourdough. She'd been feeding the starter all week with the patience of someone nursing something back to health, and that was exactly what she was doing, because a good sourdough starter was alive, and alive things that had been neglected needed time and care before they gave back what they were capable of. When the bread came out of the oven Friday evening, the sound of it was different from the cornbread. The crackle of the crust had a different quality, deeper, more complex. The smell spread through the cookhouse and out into the yard, and Dell, who was washing up at the pump outside, lifted his head like a dog scenting something on the wind and walked inside 3 minutes before supper was called. Nobody said anything about the bread until Tom cut into it. Then he stopped, put down the knife, looked at the inside of the loaf the way a man looks at something he didn't expect to be as good as it is. "Lord above," he said quietly. That was the whole review. It was sufficient. 16 men ate sourdough bread that had been made from a starter that Cora had brought back from the edge of dead, and the table was quieter than it had been all week. Not because there was nothing to say, because the food had taken up all the room that words usually occupy. Wes sat at the end of the table and ate his bread and did not look at Cora. He was aware that he wanted to look at her, which was why he deliberately didn't. He'd told himself a lot of things this week, and most of them had turned out to be wrong. He didn't want to make the same error in a new direction. The situation was what it was. She was his cook. She was good at her job. The ranch ran better with her in it. That was the arrangement. That was sufficient. He ate his bread and kept his eyes on his plate. After supper, he found her in the storage shed, taking inventory by lantern light. She was moving through the shelves with a piece of paper in one hand, writing as she went, her lips moving slightly the way people's do when they're doing math in their head. He stood in the doorway. "End of the week." She looked up. "I know." "You want to tell me what you found back there, or should I just wait for the paper?" She looked at her list. "You're low on cornmeal. Flour's manageable for another 10 days if I'm careful. Salt pork's going to run out by Wednesday next week. Coffee's fine." She paused. "You need lard. You always need lard on a working ranch, and someone stopped ordering enough of it probably 2 months ago." He leaned against the doorframe. "Anything else? Your dry goods supplier is overcharging you on coffee beans," she said. "I checked the price against what I used to pay in Abilene. You're paying 30% more than you should be. Either they think you're not paying attention, or they know you're not." He looked at her. She looked back at him, steady as ever. "I'll look at the invoices," he said. "You should," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "You found all that in a week." "I find things fast," she said. "I had to learn to." He looked at her for a moment, really looked, not the sideways assessing glances he'd been managing all week, but directly the way you look at something you're trying to understand. She was 31. She looked older than that, but not from age. From density. The way some people pack more living into years than others. "You said your husband died of fever," he said. He hadn't meant to say it. It came out because he'd been thinking about it, and the shed was quiet, and the words arrived before the better judgment that usually stopped them. She was still for a moment. 1878, August. Daniel was 34. "I'm sorry," Wes said. "Thank you," she said. The way she said it, simply without performance, told him she'd received this condolence many times and had long since learned to accept it without the grief getting loose in front of strangers. How long after? We were on our own by September, she said. Nora was 4. I did washing and mending through the fall, then I caught on with a railroad contract kitchen in December. She looked at her list. I was a better cook than the man they had. He knew it, and I knew it, and eventually the foreman knew it, and I ran that kitchen for 2 years. Until what? Wes said. Until the contract ended and the railroad moved west, and I wasn't willing to follow it with a child, she said. I had an offer in Amarillo that fell through. Then I saw your advertisement. She folded the list in half and looked at him. That's the whole story, Mr. Tate. He looked at her for a moment. Wes, he said. She tilted her head slightly. If you're going to be managing my provisions and catching my suppliers cheating me, he said, you might as well use my first name. Something moved through her expression. Not quite a smile, the territory just past it. Wes, then. He pushed off the door frame. Monday you're on full wages, full arrangement. He paused. That means permanent quarters, not trial. Better room if there's one to spare. He thought about it. There's a room off the south end of the cookhouse. Bigger. Has a proper door. She looked at him. Nora can have the side room, he said. She shouldn't be sleeping on a cot. Cora was quiet for a moment that lasted slightly longer than most moments. Thank you, she said. The same words as before, but with a different weight in them. Wes nodded, turned to go. Wes, he stopped. You're being overcharged on the flour too, she said. Not as much, but some. He almost laughed. He didn't, but it was close. I'll pull every invoice we have. I can go through them, she said, if you want. He stood in the doorway with that offer hanging in the air between them, and he understood that it was not a small thing she was offering. She was a cook. Accounts weren't her job. She was offering because she'd found a problem and couldn't leave a problem alone once she'd found it. All right, he said. I'll need the last 6 months, she said. And something to write on that isn't a flour sack. He left her to her inventory. He walked back to the main house across the dark yard, and the cookhouse light was still going behind him. Cora at her numbers, same as she'd been at her dough, and he thought not for the first time this week that whatever he'd expected when he posted that advertisement, it had not been this. It was Dell who said the thing out loud. Of course it was Dell. Saturday morning, Wes was in the yard checking on a fence repair when Dell came up beside him with his coffee and stood there in the comfortable silence of a man who's been on the same ranch long enough to say what he thinks. She's not what you expected, Dell said. No, Wes said. She's better, Dell said. Wes didn't answer. Dell drank his coffee. Garth'll come around. He always does when the food's good enough long enough. I know, Wes said. Tom thinks she's the best cook in the Panhandle. Tom thinks a lot of things. Dell was quiet for a moment. Then, the little girl started reading from that McGuffey reader at breakfast this morning, just sitting there with her bread reading out loud to herself. He paused, quietly, wasn't bothering a soul. Wes said nothing. Just thought you'd want to know, Dell said, and walked away. Wes stood at the fence and looked out at the pasture and made no particular effort to examine what he was thinking, because he had found that certain thoughts were better left alone until they were ready to be understood. The ranch was running right. The men were eating. The kitchen had come back to life. That was enough to know for now. That had to be enough. Inside the cookhouse, Cora was already planning next week's meals. She was 3 days ahead the way she always was. She was always 3 days ahead. 3 weeks passed the way good weeks do on a working ranch, fast and full measured in meals and weather, and the slow accumulation of things going right. Cora went through 6 months of Wes's invoices on a Sunday afternoon with a pencil and a piece of brown paper she'd cut from a supply sack. She sat at the work table after the noon meal and worked through the numbers the way she worked through everything methodically, without commentary, until she had what she was looking for. Then she walked to the main house and knocked on the door. Wes opened it. He had a cup of coffee in one hand and the look of a man who had been doing his own quiet thinking. "You're being cheated on 5 separate lines," she said. She handed him the brown paper. Coffee beans, flour, lard, salt, pork, and cornmeal. The cornmeal markups the worst, nearly 40% over market rate. The others run between 15 and 30. She waited while he looked at it. 6 months of overcharging on those 5 items comes to just under $90. He looked up from this paper. $90, he said. 87 and some cents, she said. I was conservative. The actual number might be higher. He looked at the paper again. His jaw had gone tight. Calloway's been our supplier for 4 years. I know, she said. His name's on every invoice. Wes was quiet for a long moment. Then, how sure are you? I checked the Abilene rates against what I paid in Kansas and what the Amarillo market was running last fall, she said. I wrote those figures down on the right side of the paper. You can verify them yourself when you go to town. He looked at the right side of the paper. She had written the comparison figures in neat columns, every number sourced and labeled. Not just the accusation, the proof. He folded the paper carefully and set it on the table beside him. I'll ride to town Tuesday, he said. That's your business, she said. I just thought you should know. She turned to go. Cora. She stopped. Thank you, he said. The same 2 words she'd said to him twice before. But when he said them, they had a particular weight, like the words were doing more work than words usually do. She nodded once and went back to the cookhouse. She did not let herself think about the way he'd looked at her when he said it. She was very deliberate about not thinking about that. Tuesday came, and Wes rode to town. He came back in the late afternoon with a look on his face that Cora recognized from a distance, the look of a man who has confirmed something he had hoped wasn't true. He didn't stop at the cookhouse. He went straight to the barn, and the sound of things being moved around in there had a particular energy to it that made Tom and Dell exchange a glance across the supper table. Supply problem, Tom said low. Supply man problem, Dell said, even lower. Nobody asked Cora anything. But when Wes came to supper that evening, he ate quietly, and when he was done, he said, You were right on all 5 lines, and one you missed the coffee was even worse than you calculated. Calloway's been shorting the weight on the sacks. The table was very still. I've terminated the contract, Wes said. I'll be sourcing through Harmon Brothers in Clarendon starting next month. He looked at Cora. I'll need you to build the new order list. I'll have it by morning, she said. He nodded. That was that. But across the table something had shifted. The men had heard it, she caught it, she proved it. He acted on it, and that chain of events meant something on a working ranch where trust was the currency everything ran on. Cora hadn't just cooked good food. She'd protected the ranch. She'd put $87 back into Wes Tate's pocket. Garth Pickett, who had not spoken directly to Cora since the morning with the skillet, picked up his coffee cup. He looked at it. He set it down. Good supper, he said. To no one in particular. To the table. Dell didn't move a muscle. Tom stared at his bread. Cora stood at the stove and said nothing. But she heard it. And it landed the way small things land when they've been a long time coming. The second week of November came in cold and mean. Texas Panhandle cold was different from Kansas cold. Kansas had more warning. The temperature dropped in stages, giving you time to prepare. Panhandle cold arrived like an argument that had already been decided somewhere else. You woke up to it. One morning the ground was ordinary, and the next morning it had an inch of frost, and the wind was cutting in from the north with serious intent. Cora adjusted the kitchen without being asked. Hot oatmeal in the morning before the biscuits, because men doing cold weather work needed slow fuel, not just fast bread. Extra coffee always hot, because men came in from the corrals in the afternoon chilled through, and the coffee was the first thing they reached for. Heavier suppers, more beans, more pork fat, more of the filling starchy depth that winter labor demanded. She did it all without announcement and without asking Wes for permission to spend the extra provisions it required. She'd looked at the stores, she'd done the math, it was within what the ranch could support. So she did it. Wes noticed on the third day. He didn't say anything directly. He wasn't a man who narrated his observations, but at supper, he looked at his bowl with something deliberate in his attention, the way you look at something you're trying to understand, and then he looked at Cora. "You changed the menu," he said. "Weather changed," she said. He looked at his bowl again. "What's in this?" "Beans, pork, fat, dried corn, and pepper. It's a hunter's stew, essentially. Higher calorie count than the regular bean soup. Keeps men warmer in wind." She looked at him. "I checked the stores before I made the call. We have the supplies for it." He ate a spoonful, ate another. "You didn't ask?" "No," she said. "I didn't." He looked at her. "Why not?" "Because it was a kitchen decision," she said, "and the kitchen is mine to manage. If it had been a supply question, if I'd needed to order extra, I would have asked. But it wasn't." She paused one beat. "If I overstepped, tell me." He was quiet for a moment. Around them, the table was full of men eating hot stew and not looking at this exchange. "You didn't overstep," Wes said. He went back to eating, and that sentence, said quietly in a full room, was the thing that Dell filed away and thought about later. Because "you didn't overstep" from Wesley Tate wasn't a minor acknowledgement. It was a statement of territory. It was him saying the kitchen is yours, and your judgment in it is real. Dell had worked for Wes for 11 years. He had never heard him say that to anyone. I said, Nora had started helping. Not in any way that created work for Cora or got in the men's way, but small things, the tasks that small hands and willing attention could manage. She kept the wood box by the stove filled, dragging pieces from the pile outside and stacking them with the focus of a child who understood that her usefulness had a direct effect on whether they stayed. She kept Cora's pencils sharp. She swept the cookhouse floor after supper with a broom that was too tall for her, managing it with a determination that made Tom bite the inside of his cheek to keep from saying something that would embarrass them both. Tom had become, over the course of 3 weeks, thoroughly devoted to Nora Halloran, in the completely unsentimental way of young men who refuse to admit that they like children. He taught her to tie a better knot than the ones Cora had shown her. He showed her how to read a weather sign in the clouds, which she immediately applied to every set of clouds she subsequently observed, reporting her findings to whoever was nearest. He once spent 45 minutes helping her look for a button that had fallen off her coat in the yard, and when they found it, he produced a needle and thread from the bunkhouse, where he had no business having a needle and thread, and sewed it back on himself. Cora watched this without comment. Once, when Tom was out of earshot, Dell said to her, "He grew up with younger sisters, 5 of them." Cora said, "I figured." Dell nodded. "He doesn't know how to not help a child when one's in front of him." Cora said, "He's a good man." Dell said, "Most of them are once they're fed." She almost laughed. Not quite, but close enough that Dell counted it. The thing that nobody had named yet was starting to take on shape. Not the thing between Wes and Cora that was still carefully unexamined by both of them, managed through practical conversation and deliberate distance. The other thing. The thing that Roan Fork Ranch was becoming now, after 3 weeks of hot meals and fixed coffee and a child reading McGuffey readers in the corner, and a cook who caught suppliers cheating and adjusted the menu for winter without asking permission. The ranch felt different. That was the only word for it. Not better run, though it was better run. Not more efficient, though it was more efficient. Different. Like a house that had been going through the motions of being lived in had suddenly remembered what living actually felt like. Wes felt it and didn't examine it. The men felt it and called it the food, because that was the simplest explanation. Dell felt it and kept his own counsel. And Cora felt it and told herself it was only because the work was going well. Because she'd been in enough places where the work went badly to recognize when it was going well, and this was that. Nothing more. She was very firm about that. It was a Friday evening, 2 days before the third week ended, when Garth Pickett sat down next to Cora's work table while she was making pie crust. She saw him come in. She kept working. He sat there for a moment without speaking, which was unusual for Garth, who generally filled silence with something. "My mother made pie every Friday," he said finally. Cora pressed the heel of her hand into the lard and flour. "What kind?" "Apple mostly, sometimes dried peach." "I'm doing dried apple," she said. "Wes's stores have a good supply." Garth was quiet again. She could feel him working his way toward something. Men like Garth did not arrive at the thing they meant to say directly. They circled it first the way you circle a horse you're not sure of. "I was wrong to talk to you the way I did," he said. "The first week." Cora set the dough down. She looked at him. He was looking at the table, not at her. His jaw was tight the way it always was, but there was something different in it. Not stubbornness this time. Something that cost him more than stubbornness. "You don't have to say that," she said. "I know I don't have to," he said. "That's why I'm saying it." She looked at him for a moment. 22 years on one ranch. That kind of tenure didn't just produce loyalty, it produced something close to ownership, and ownership made men territorial about things they had no legal claim to, including the way a place felt and smelled and ran. He hadn't been cruel to her out of malice. He'd been afraid of change in the only home he'd known for more than 2 decades. She understood that. She didn't excuse it, but she understood it. "I appreciate it," she said. "The pie," he said, standing up with the awkward speed of a man who's done something difficult and needs to leave before he has to feel good about it. "My mother put a little cinnamon in the crust, not just the filling." Cora looked at him. "Just a thought," he said, and walked out. She stood there for a moment. Then she reached for the small tin of cinnamon on the upper shelf. Wes, passing the cookhouse doorway a few minutes later, smelled something that stopped him mid-step. He turned his head. He looked through the doorway at Cora, adding cinnamon to pie crust, moving with that particular economy of motion she always had. He kept walking, but he carried the smell of it, cinnamon and apple and winter cold, the rest of the way to the barn. And he didn't know why it sat in his chest. The way it did, like something that had been missing so long, he'd stopped noticing the missing of it, and now couldn't stop. The twist came on a Thursday morning 18 days into November, from a direction Cora had not anticipated. A buggy came up the ranch road at mid-morning. She heard the wheels from the cookhouse and looked out to see Wes walking from the barn toward it, wiping his hands on his work cloth. 2 men she didn't know stepped down. Both were in town clothes, not working clothes, which on a cattle ranch in November meant they were not here about cattle. Cora went back to her bread. But 30 minutes later, Wes came into the cookhouse alone, and he had the specific quiet of a man managing something difficult. "I need to talk to you," he said. She set down her knife. "Those men are from the bank in Clarendon," he said. "I've been in a land dispute with a neighbor, Harlan Rourke, for the better part of a year. Rourke claims a section of the east pasture is his. He's got a surveyor he's paid to say the same." He paused. "The bank wants the dispute resolved before they extend the spring loan. If I can't show clean title to the east section, I can't make the improvements I need to carry the herd through next year." Cora looked at him. "What's the actual boundary question?" He looked at her like he hadn't expected that to be her first response. "The original land grant," he said. 1867. The markers were set by a man named Aldous Pruitt. Pruitt died in 1874. Rourke is claiming Pruitt set the east line 200 yards further west than I say he did. "Do you have the original survey documentation?" she said. "I have what my father kept," he said, "which is not complete. But some of it." "Some." She folded her hands on the table. "Where's the documentation now?" He looked at her for a moment. "Why?" "Because if you have any original papers, anything Pruitt signed or witnessed, a surveyor who's honest can read it against the current land records and give you an independent measurement." She paused. "You need someone Rourke hasn't paid." Wes was very still. "How do you know about land surveys?" Daniel worked a survey crew for 2 years before we married, she said. I learned what I learned. She met his eyes. Get your father's papers. I'll look at them. He brought them that afternoon. A worn leather folder, field notes, 2 hand-drawn maps, and a letter from the original land office. Cora spread them on the work table after supper and went through them the way she went through the invoices, methodically, quietly, until she had what she was looking for. She found it 40 minutes later. This letter, she said when Wes came back to check on her. She pointed to the land office letter. It references a secondary witness to Pruitt's survey, a man named Eli Carmack. It says Carmack was present when the east line markers were set and signed the field record. Wes came to the table and leaned over the paper. Carmack. If this man is still alive, or if there's a copy of that field record filed somewhere, you have a second verification that has nothing to do with Rourke's paid surveyor. She looked at him. Do you know the name? I might, he said slowly. There's an old-timer in Wheeler County. Name might be Carmack. He straightened. I need to ride out there. You need to ride out there soon, she said, before Rourke moves to formalize his surveyor's claim. Wes looked at the paper, then at Cora. You found this in 40 minutes, he said. It was in the letter, she said. I just read it carefully. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. It wasn't gratitude exactly. It was something more unsettled than gratitude. Like a man who has been doing a calculation in his head for 3 weeks and has just arrived at a number that changes the shape of the problem. Cora, he said. Wes. Who are you? He said, not accusing, not teasing. A genuine question said quietly in an empty kitchen over a worn leather folder. She looked at him steadily. I'm your cook, she said. And your supper's going to be late if I don't get back to the stove. He almost said something else. She could see it in his face, the words forming the decision made to hold them back for now. He stepped away from the table. I'll ride to Wheeler County Saturday. Take the letter, she said. Don't leave it here. He took the letter. He went to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame. The pie Friday night, he said. With the cinnamon in the crust. I don't know where you got that idea, but... He stopped. It was the best thing I've eaten in a very long time. He walked out before she could answer. Cora stood in the kitchen alone and put her hand flat on the work table and looked at nothing for a full 10 seconds. Then she went back to the stove. She was 3 days ahead. She always had to be 3 days ahead. But for the first time since she'd arrived at Rowan Fork Ranch, she caught herself thinking about a 4th day, and a 5th, and the particular shape of a winter that wasn't ending but deepening, pulling everything and everyone in it closer together against the cold. She put another log on the fire and told herself it was only practical. She was not entirely sure she believed it. Wes rode to Wheeler County on Saturday and came back Sunday evening with mud on his boots and something different in the set of his jaw. Cora was banking the cookhouse fire for the night when she heard his horse come into the yard. She heard him unsaddle and put the horse up, heard the barn door, the bucket, the ordinary sounds of a man returning from a long ride. She finished what she was doing. She did not go to the door. He came to her. He knocked, which he had never done before, and that alone told her something significant had happened. Come in, she said. He came in and sat down at the work table without being invited to, which was also new, and set his hat on the table in front of him and looked at it for a moment. Eli Carmack is alive, he said. 81 years old, lives with his daughter in Canadian. He remembers the survey. He remembers Pruitt. He remembers exactly where the east line markers were set, because he drove the stakes himself. He paused. 230 yards east of where Rourke's man claims. Cora sat down across from him. He still has his copy of the field record, Wes said. Signed, witnessed, dated, the original. He looked up from his hat. Cora, the man kept it in a tin box under his bed for 50 years because he said a good surveyor always keeps his records. He pulled it out and showed it to me, and it was exactly what we needed. She folded her hands on the table. What happens now? I take Carmack's record to the county land office and file it against Rourke's claim, he said. With an original witness document and a living signatory, Rourke's paid surveyor doesn't have a case. He stopped. My lawyer in Clarendon says it's over, that Rourke will drop it once he sees what I have. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. That's good, Cora said. That's more than good, he said. He looked at her directly without the careful sideways angles he'd been managing for weeks. That's the ranch. That's the east pasture. That's the spring loan and the herd and everything we spent the last year worried about. He stopped again, looked at his hat. I would not have found that letter in my father's papers. I've looked through that folder twice in the past year, and I did not find it. You weren't looking for a name, she said. You were looking for a boundary measurement. Different thing. You found it in 40 minutes, he said, reading papers you'd never seen before. I read carefully, she said. Stop doing that, he said. She looked at him. Stop reducing what you do to the smallest possible description, he said. You found it. You knew what it meant. You told me what to do with it. His voice wasn't loud. It was the opposite of loud. It had the particular quiet of something said with full weight behind it. That matters. You matter. And I'd like you to stop pretending otherwise. The cookhouse was very still. Outside, the wind had come up, the dry, cold panhandle wind that found every gap in every wall. But in here, the fire was steady, and the kitchen smelled of bread and coffee and the remnants of supper. Cora looked at the man across the table from her and did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, All right. It was only 2 words. But from Cora Halloran, who chose every word with the care of someone who'd learned that words spent carelessly were words wasted, those 2 words were substantial. Wes looked at her for another moment. Then he picked up his hat and stood. I'll be going to Clarendon Tuesday with the documents. I'll need someone to manage the morning meal without me here. The morning meal has never required you to be here, she said. Something crossed his face that was almost a smile. Not quite, but close enough to be identifiable as the territory. No, he said. I don't suppose it has. He went to the door. He stopped. Thank you, Cora, he said. 3 times now he'd said it, each time with more in it than the time before. She nodded. She did not trust herself to say anything else. He walked out into the dark and the wind, and she sat alone in the kitchen and listened to the fire and made herself breathe evenly until the sound of his boots on the porch steps faded. Then she got up and put the kettle on, because something had to be done with her hands. The storm came on a Tuesday. The same Tuesday, Wes was in Clarendon. It came fast, and it came mean, which was the panhandle way. No gradual darkening, no slow build. The sky went the color of a bruise by 10 in the morning, and by noon the temperature had dropped 15 degrees, and the wind was driving sleet sideways against the cookhouse walls. Dell came in at noon, looking like he'd been walking through something hostile, which he had. It's going to be bad, he said. Cora was already doubling the stew. How bad? Bad enough that Wes isn't making it back tonight, Dell said. Road to Clarendon will be mud by afternoon and ice by dark. She didn't pause in what she was doing. The men will be in early. Tell them supper is at 4. Dell looked at her. You sure you can manage? Dell, she said. He stopped. Go tell the men supper is at 4, she said. He went. The storm was fully present by 1 o'clock. The temperature was still dropping, and the wind had found a pitch that made the cookhouse walls shudder at intervals, not from weakness, but from the sheer insistence of what was pushing against them. Nora had come in from her afternoon errands, and was at her small table very still, listening to the wind with the wide eyes of a child calibrating how afraid to be. Mama, she said. It's a bad storm, Cora said. Not a dangerous one. We're inside and the fire is good and there's food for everyone. That's all that matters right now. Nora looked at her. Where's Mr. Tate? Clarendon, Cora said. He'll stay in town until it passes. He's a smart man, he won't ride in this. Nora absorbed this. So you're in charge? Cora looked at her daughter. I'm always in charge of this kitchen, she said. The storm doesn't change that. Nora looked at the wall at the sound behind it, and then back at her mother. And whatever she saw in Cora's face was sufficient, because she picked up her McGuffey reader and went back to her lesson. The men came in at 4, all 16 of them, in various states of cold and wet, and the particular grim energy of men who've been working in bad weather and are holding themselves together with the knowledge that warmth and food are close. They came in, and they found both. Cora had 2 pots going, the heavy hunter's stew she'd been making since the cold came in, and a second pot of boiled dried apple and cinnamon that she'd started that morning when she'd looked at the sky and made her calculations. The bread was out of the oven and on the boards. The coffee was made, and a second pot in reserve. The men sat down with the concentrated focus of people who are genuinely hungry in the physical bone-deep way that cold outdoor labor produces, and they ate. It was Tom who said at first, halfway through his second bowl, putting the spoon down and looking at the table in front of him like he was trying to understand something. "What's in the stew tonight?" he said. "Same as last week," Cora said from the stove. "Hunter's stew, beans, pork fat, dried corn." "There's something else," Tom said. "Smoked pepper," she said. "And a little molasses. It's a cold weather addition." Tom looked at the bowl. He picked up his spoon. He ate another bite. "It's different," he said. "Better." "Everything's better when you're cold enough," she said. "No," Tom said, and his voice was serious in the way that young men's voices get when they're saying something true, and they know it's true. "This is actually better. This is the best thing I've eaten since I don't know since when." Around the table, heads went down again. But there was something different in the posture of the room. Not the grateful silence of the first week. Something more settled. Something that wasn't about the novelty of good food anymore, but about the expectation of it, the bone-deep comfort of knowing that this was what this place was now. This was what coming in from the cold meant on Roan Fork Ranch. Garth Pickett ate 2 full bowls. He didn't comment. He didn't need to. Dell looked at the window, at the storm pressing against it, and then at the cookhouse, at the fire, and the food, and the woman at the stove. He thought about something. Then he drank his coffee and kept it to himself. The first crisis came at 6:30. One of the younger hands, a boy of 19 named Cass, who'd only been on the ranch 2 months, came in from checking the stock, and his face was wrong. Not just cold wrong. Something happened wrong. "The south corral gate blew open," he said. 3 horses got out. Dell and Rooney went after them, but he stopped, looked at the room. "Rooney's horse went down on the ice. Rooney's hurt." The table came alive instantly, that particular organized urgency of working men who know what to do in an emergency because they've had to do it before. Dell came in 2 minutes behind Cass with Rooney's arm over his shoulders. Rooney was conscious walking, but holding his right arm at an angle that told the story without words. "Sit him here," Cora said, pulling the bench out from the end of the table. Dell looked at her. "I need to—" "Sit him down," she said. "You can go back out in 5 minutes. Let me look first." Dell sat Rooney down. The man was somewhere in his mid-30s, weathered and quiet, and now very pale under his tan. He was breathing carefully, the breath of someone managing pain with deliberate control. "Where did you land?" Cora said. "Right shoulder," Rooney said. "Went down on the ice. Horse is fine." "Can you move your fingers?" He moved them. Slowly, but he moved them. "Not broken," she said. "Separated, maybe. Dislocated." She put her hand on his shoulder with a careful, practiced pressure, the pressure of someone who had learned anatomy from necessity, from years of being in places where you were the only person available to make the assessment. "Does that—" "Yes," he said through his teeth. "I know," she said. "I'm not going to make it worse. I need you to hold still." The room was completely silent. 16 men watching. Nora had gone to her corner without being told. Cora worked quickly. She'd seen dislocated shoulders on the railroad men who fell from ties, men who got thrown from horses, men who did violent work in conditions that generated violent accidents. She knew what could be moved and what couldn't, and what needed a doctor. This one needed a doctor, but the doctor was 12 miles away, and the road was ice. "I can't set it," she said clearly to Rooney and to the room. "That needs the doctor. What I can do is immobilize it so the ride doesn't make it worse." She looked at Dell. "I need 2 strips of cloth and a flat piece of wood about this long." She showed him with her hands. "There's pine board in the storage shed." Dell was already moving. Tom said from somewhere behind her, "What can I do?" "Get his coat off," she said. "Carefully, left arm first, then ease the right side off without pulling." Tom moved to Rooney and began working the coat with the steady concentration of a young man who is afraid, but functioning. Rooney said nothing. His jaw was tight. Cora got the cloth from the linen shelf. Dell came back with the board. She worked fast and neat, immobilizing the shoulder, the way she'd seen it done, and the way she'd done it once before on the railroad, when the camp's cook had gone down and she was the closest thing to competent that was available. When it was done, Rooney looked at her. "Thank you," he said, the same 2 words Wes always said. But from Rooney, they carried a different kind of weight, the direct, simple weight of a man in pain who has been helped. "Someone needs to ride for the doctor in the morning," she said to the room. "Tonight, he stays warm and still." She looked at Dell. "Can someone ride tomorrow at first light?" "I'll go," Tom said. "Tom's the fastest rider," Dell confirmed. "First light," Cora said. "Storm permitting." She looked at the window. The sleet was still coming. "Tonight he stays here, not in the bunkhouse. I want him close to the fire." Nobody argued. Nobody questioned whether it was her call to make. They just moved Rooney to the cot in the side room. Nora had already, without being asked, taken her blanket off the bed and left it folded on the chair, and the evening reorganized itself around the new situation with the practical efficiency of people who trusted the person giving directions. The second crisis arrived at 9 o'clock while most of the men had gone back to the bunkhouse. Dell was still in the cookhouse he'd stayed without explanation, which was explanation enough when the sound of a horse came through the storm. One horse. Coming fast, which meant someone was riding hard in bad conditions, which meant something was wrong. Cora was at the stove. She heard it before Dell did. "Someone's coming," she said. Dell was at the door before the knock came. It was a rider she didn't know. Young, maybe 17, completely soaked the horse behind him, trembling from the run. He pushed past Dell into the cookhouse and stood there dripping. "Roan Fork Ranch," he said. "Yes," Dell said. "I've got a message for Wesley Tate, from his lawyer in Clarendon." He pulled a sealed envelope from inside his coat, the wax still intact despite everything. Harlan Rourke filed an emergency injunction this afternoon, before Mr. Tate got to the land office. Rourke's trying to get a court order blocking the property filing until his surveyor can be heard. The cookhouse went very quiet. Dell took the envelope. The boy said, "Mr. Tate's lawyer says he needs instructions tonight. He can fight the injunction in the morning, but he needs to know." He stopped, looked around. "Where is Mr. Tate?" "In Clarendon," Dell said grimly. "At the hotel." "Then the message already reached him," the boy said. "The lawyer sent 2 riders. I came here in case Mr. Tate had ridden home early." Dell looked at the envelope, looked at Cora. Cora was already taking off her apron. "What are you doing?" Dell said. "What did Rourke file exactly?" she said to the rider. "Did the lawyer say what grounds?" The boy blinked water off his eyelashes. "He said Rourke claims the Carmack document is a forgery, that the signature isn't genuine." The kitchen went electric. Dell said low and controlled, "It's not a forgery. Wes found the man himself. Carmack is alive." "I know that," Cora said. "But Rourke doesn't know that Wes found him. Rourke thinks Wes found a document, not a living witness." She looked at Dell with the absolute focus of someone who has already run the calculation and arrived at the answer. If Carmack can appear in person before the judge hears the injunction, if he can testify himself, not just provide a paper, Rourke's claim dies before it's born. Dell stared at her. "Carmack's in Canadian. That's 40 miles," she said. In bad weather on a good road, maybe 6 hours. Cora. Does Wes have someone in Canadian who could reach the old man tonight? She said. Anyone? Anyone at all, Dell thought. His face was working through it. The Alderman family, they're friends of Wes's from years back, live a mile outside Canadian. Can you write? She said. Yes, Dell said. Write a letter to the Aldermans. Explain what's needed. Tell them who Carmack is, where he lives, and that he needs to be in Clarendon by morning with his tin box. She was already moving to the work table, finding paper, finding the pencil. The rider can take it back through Canadian. It's on the road back. Can he make it? The boy, still dripping, still catching his breath, straightened. Yes, ma'am, my horse is tired, but I've got a fresh one at the relay post 2 miles back. I can make Canadian by midnight. Cora set paper and pencil in front of Dell. Dell sat down. He looked at her for one long moment, the look of a man who has revised his understanding of a situation entirely and is still in the process of absorbing the revision. Then he picked up the pencil and started writing. Cora stood over his shoulder. Tell them it's urgent. Tell them the ranch depends on it. Use those exact words. I know how to write a letter, Dell said. I know you do, she said. Write it anyway. He wrote it, fast and clear. Cora read it over his shoulder and said nothing. It was right. It said everything needed. Dell folded it and handed it to the rider. You understand what you're carrying? Dell said. Yes, sir, the boy said. Ride careful, Cora said. The road will be ice past the creek crossing. Take it slow at the creek even if you think you need to be fast. The boy looked at her. Yes, ma'am. He tucked the letter inside his coat, pulled his hat down, and went back out into the storm. Dell sat at the table for a moment after the door closed. You just ran a counter-move on Harlan Rourke, he said. I ran the only move available, she said. In 45 seconds, he said. She went back to the stove. The coffee's still hot. You should drink some before you go to the bunkhouse. Dell didn't move for a moment. He sat there at the table and looked at the cookhouse, at the fire at Cora's back, at the pot of stew still warming for anyone who needed it at Rooney, asleep in the side room, at the ordinary extraordinary fact of this woman standing in the middle of a crisis and running it like she'd been running crises her whole life, which he realized she had. Cora, he said. She looked at him over her shoulder. Wes doesn't know what he's got here, Dell said. I think he suspects, but he doesn't know yet. She turned back to the stove. He's a smart man. He'll figure it out. Dell drank his coffee, set the cup down, stood up. Good night, he said. Good night, Dell. He went to the door. He stopped. He was 62 years old, and he had been on Roan Fork Ranch since before Wes Tate's father died and left the place to his son. And he had seen many things in those years, and right now he was looking at the most important one. He walked out into the storm and said nothing else. Cora sat alone in the cookhouse at 10 o'clock at night, with the storm pressing at every wall, and the fire burning steady, and Rooney asleep in the side room, and Nora asleep on the small cot they'd moved into the corner. She thought about the letter Dell had written. She thought about the rider in the dark. She thought about an 81-year-old man with a tin box under his bed who might by morning be the thing that saved this ranch. She thought about Wes in Clarendon at the hotel, reading his lawyer's message by lamplight, not knowing yet what had been set in motion from his own kitchen. She put her hand flat on the work table. The oak table scarred and solid, the table she'd been working at for nearly a month, and she felt the grain of it under her palm and thought, this is not just a job anymore. She knew it the moment she thought it. She also knew she wasn't ready to say it out loud to anyone, not yet. Maybe not for a while yet. Because knowing a thing and being ready to live in it were two different kinds of courage, and she had spent so much of the last 3 years on the first kind that the second kind felt like something she had to approach slowly. She got up. She added wood to the fire. She checked on Rooney, still asleep, breathing evenly. She checked on Nora, one arm flung over the edge of the cot, the way children sleep when they feel completely safe. She stood and looked at her daughter for a long moment. Safe, she thought. Right now. Tonight. In this kitchen. She went back to the stove, sat on the bench beside it, and waited for morning. The storm raged on. She didn't move. Morning came the way it always does, after a bad storm, quietly, like it had nothing to do with what happened the night before. The wind had stopped somewhere around 4 in the morning. Cora knew the exact time because she'd been awake when it happened, sitting on the bench by the stove, where she'd spent the night, and the sudden absence of that sound was loud in its own way. She'd heard the silence arrive, and she'd let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding for hours. Tom was up and out before first light exactly as he'd said he would be. She heard him moving in the yard, heard his horse, heard the gate. She had his coffee hot, and a biscuit wrapped in cloth ready when he came to the cookhouse door, and he took it without a word. Just a look that said everything he didn't have time to say, and rode. The rest of the men came in for breakfast in stages. The storm had disrupted the usual rhythm, and everyone was moving on the slightly altered time of people who'd slept wrong and woken early and weren't entirely sure what the day was going to ask of them. Cora fed them all. The stove was going, the oatmeal was ready, the biscuits came out in 2 batches. Rooney came out of the side room on his own power, his right arm held carefully against his body, his face carrying the compressed expression of a man managing pain without wanting to make a production of it. He sat at the end of the table, and Cora put a bowl in front of him and a cup of coffee, and didn't ask him how he felt, because the answer was obvious, and asking it would have embarrassed him. "Tom's writing for the doctor," she said. "I know," he said. "I heard him go." She went back to the stove. Dell came in last. He sat down and ate his oatmeal, and looked at the window and then at Cora. "Ryder made it to Canadian," he said. She looked at him. "I sent Cass out at dawn to check the road condition, and he ran across the relay boy coming back," Dell said. "Boy confirmed he delivered the letter to the Alderman place just before midnight." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. "Now we wait," Cora said. "Now we wait." Dell agreed. She poured his coffee. She went back to work. That was all there was to do, work and wait, which had been the rhythm of her entire adult life, and she had learned to do both without letting the waiting eat the working. Wes rode in at 10:30. She heard his horse before she saw him, and then she heard him stop in the yard and speak to someone. Cass, she thought from the voice, and then the pause that meant he was being told something, and then silence. She kept her hands moving in the bread dough she was working. He came through the cookhouse door, and the first thing she noticed was that his face had already been through something. Not the writing showed in his coat and his boots. Something else. Something internal. "You knew about Rourke's injunction before I did," he said. "The writer came here first," she said. "Looking for you." "Dell told me what you did." He came to the work table and stood on the other side of it. "You sent the letter to the aldermans." "Dell wrote it," she said. Cora." His voice had that quiet in it again, the full weight quiet. "Stop." She stopped. "Dell wrote the words," Wes said. "You thought of it. You thought of it in 45 seconds in the middle of a storm with a hurt man in your back room and a child asleep in the corner." He looked at her across the table. "Did Carmack make it?" "I don't know yet," she said. "Do you?" He looked at her for a long moment. "He did," he said. "My lawyer sent a rider out at first light. Carmack arrived in Clarendon at 8 this morning in the alderman's wagon, walked into the courthouse with his tin box, and introduced himself to the judge as the man who drove the stakes himself in 1867. He paused. Rourke's lawyer took one look at him and asked for a recess. The bread dough sat between Cora's hands. "Rourke dropped the injunction at 9:45, Wes said. "My lawyer filed the original survey documentation while Rourke's man was still packing his papers." He stopped. "It's over. The east pasture is mine. The loan goes through. The ranch is whole." The kitchen was very quiet. Cora pressed her hands into the dough. Then she lifted them away and set them flat on the table and looked at him and said nothing, because there was nothing adequate to say. "I need you to understand something," Wes said. His voice had changed. Still quiet, but differently quiet, the quiet of a man who has made a decision and is now living inside it. I need you to understand what this ranch would look like right now if you hadn't been in it. Wes, the food, he said. That's the obvious part. The men are fed and they're right because of you, but that's not what I mean. He put his hands on the table. The invoices, Calloway, $90 back in my pocket, the letter in my father's folder, Carmack, last night. He stopped. Every one of those things, every single one happened because you were here and you were paying attention and you didn't stop at what was asked of you. She looked at him steadily. I didn't send for any of that, he said. I sent for a cook, and I got something I don't have a word for. The moment sat between them, large and real. You have a word for it, she said. You're just deciding whether to say it. He looked at her. Yes, he said. I am. She waited. He looked down at his hands on the table, then back up at her. And Wesley Tate, who said things carefully or not at all, said, I didn't send for a cook. I sent for survival. That's all I thought I needed. And I ended up finding something I didn't know I was missing. The words sat in the kitchen the way true things sit without needing anything added to them. Cora looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the stagecoach pulling away on the first day. She thought about Nora saying, I think he'll let us stay, Mama. She thought about 6 months of invoices on a Sunday afternoon, and a letter in a worn leather folder, and an old man in Canadian with a tin box under his bed. She thought about how the things that save you are almost never the things you went looking for. I don't need to be wanted out of pity, she said. I never have. I need to be wanted because of what I actually am. He looked at her. I know what you are, he said. I've known for 3 weeks. I've been slow to say it. You're a careful man, she said. Too careful sometimes, he said. She almost said something. She let the almost go. Tom came back at noon with the doctor from town, a small, sharp-eyed man named Fielding, who smelled of camphor and efficiency. Fielding examined Rooney's shoulder with the practiced speed of a man who has assessed a great many ranch injuries, confirmed the dislocation Cora had identified, administered treatment that made Rooney go white, and then exhale like he'd put something down he'd been carrying for hours, and prescribed 2 weeks of light duty. He was packing his bag to leave when he paused and looked at the improvised immobilization Cora had done the night before. Who did this? He said. I did, Cora said from the stove. He looked at it. At the board, the cloth strips the way the shoulder had been stabilized without any movement of the joint. This is correct, he said. This is exactly right. If someone had tried to move the joint in the night, it could have caused serious damage. He looked at her. Where did you learn to do this? Railroad camp, she said. We didn't always have a doctor available. Dr. Fielding looked at her for a moment, with the particular expression of a person reassessing what they're looking at. You've done this before. Once, she said. I paid attention. He finished packing his bag. At the door, he said to the room in general, This woman kept that man's injury from getting considerably worse. Someone should know that. He left. Rooney, from his chair at the end of the table, said quietly, I knew it. Last night, when you were working on my shoulder. He paused. I knew you knew what you were doing. I knew enough, Cora said. Not more than that. Enough was what we had, Rooney said. Enough was everything. Tom sat down at the table with the look of a young man who has ridden hard in cold weather and is now encountering a lot of feeling in a short amount of time and isn't sure what to do with any of it. He poured himself coffee and wrapped both hands around the cup and stared at it. Rooney's shoulder, he said. Rourke, the storm, Carmack. He looked up. Is a normal day around here ever going to feel normal again? Dell across the table said, Define normal. Tom thought about it. I can't anymore, he said. Dell almost smiled. Good, he said. The twist that nobody saw coming arrived that afternoon. It came in the form of a letter, Not dramatic, not urgent. Just a letter delivered by the post rider who made the ranch circuit every 2 weeks. Wes brought it from the road and looked at the return address and went still. He brought it to Cora. She looked at it. She did not understand why he was bringing it to her until she saw the name in the upper left corner. Mrs. Everett Halloran, Galveston, Texas. She took the letter from him. Her hands were steady. She opened it. It was from Daniel's mother. She had not heard from the woman in 14 months, not since a brief cold letter after Daniel's death that had made clear the elder Mrs. Halloran held Cora responsible in some imprecise but total way for the circumstances that had led to her son's death. The fever, the railroad camp, the life Cora had pulled them into. She read the letter standing at the work table with Wes across from her watching. When she was done, she set it down. "What does it say?" Wes said. She looked at it for a moment. "She wants Nora," she said. Her voice was level. "She says she's consulted a lawyer in Galveston. She says that as the child's paternal grandmother, she has a claim to custody, and that Nora would have a better life in Galveston with a proper home and proper schooling than—" She stopped. She picked up the letter again, found the line. She read it without inflection. Then following a widowed working woman from one labor camp to the next. The kitchen went silent. Wes looked at the letter in her hand. "Can she do that?" "She can try," Cora said. "Whether she can succeed is a different question." "What do you need?" he said. She looked at him. The question was so direct, so immediate, with so little distance between the problem and his willingness to meet it, that it caught her off guard in a way that very few things did. "I need to know if this is a real legal threat, or a widow's grief looking for somewhere to go," she said. "I need a lawyer." "I have one in Clarendon," Wes said. "He's already had a good week. He'll see you tomorrow." She looked at the letter again. "I've been moving for 2 years," she said. "Railroad Camp Amarillo here. Every time we moved, I told Nora it was going to be all right." She paused. "I need this to be the last move." Wes looked at her. Something in his face had resolved the way a face looks when a decision that has been forming for a long time finally arrives. "Then let it be," he said. She looked at him. "Stay," he said. "Not on trial, not temporary. Stay." He held her gaze. "I'm not asking you because of the kitchen or the invoices or Carmack or last night. I'm asking you because this ranch is better with you in it, and I am—" He stopped. He started again. "I am better, with you here." The cookhouse was completely still. Outside, the last of the storm's aftermath dripped from the eaves. Somewhere across the yard, one of the horses moved in the barn. Ordinary sounds. The sounds of a place that was running right full of life. "You're asking me to stay as your cook," she said carefully. "I'm asking you to stay," he said. "We can define the rest of it as slowly as you need to." She looked at him for a long moment. "Nora's going to ask questions," she said. "Nora's been asking me questions since the second morning," he said. "Last week she asked me why I didn't smile more. I didn't have a good answer." Cora looked at her hands, at the work table. At the kitchen she'd been running for a month, the kitchen she'd brought back to life from nothing, the starter she'd nursed back from the edge, the kitchen where she'd learned 16 men's names and caught a supplier cheating, and found a letter that saved a ranch, and spent a stormy night keeping people fed and safe while the world pressed in from all sides. She thought about what she'd said to Nora on the first day. "I need this to be the last move." She looked up. "I'll see your lawyer tomorrow," she said, "and we'll deal with Mrs. Halloran's letter the right way." She paused. "And then we'll talk about the rest." "That's enough," he said. "It's not a yes," she said. "I know," he said. "But it's not a no. And from you—" He stopped. The corner of his mouth moved. "From you, a not no is worth more than most people's yes." She said nothing. But something in her face shifted the particular shift that happens when something defended for a very long time lets itself open by one careful degree. The lawyer's name was Beaumont, and he was a small, precise man who wore his intelligence visibly. He read Mrs. Halloran's letter twice, asked Cora 4 questions, and then set the letter down on his desk and looked at her. "This is a threat," he said, "not a case." "Explain the difference," Cora said. "A case requires standing," he said. "In Texas, a maternal parent in active custody with no finding of neglect or unfitness has primary legal standing over a paternal grandparent. Your mother-in-law would need to demonstrate that you are unfit, that Nora is in danger or neglected or improperly cared for in order to make this anything more than a letter." He looked at her over his spectacles. "Are you those things?" "No," Cora said. "I didn't think so." He looked at Wes, who was sitting beside Cora, not because anyone had asked him to come, but because he had simply stood up when she was ready to leave and gotten his hat and come. "Is this child fed, housed, educated, safe?" "Yes," Wes said. "Is she in a stable household with consistent care?" Wes looked at Cora. "Yes," he said. Beaumont folded the letter and handed it back to Cora. "I'll write to Mrs. Halloran's lawyer in Galveston. I'll do it this week, in language that makes the legal landscape clear." He paused. "If she pursues it further, we'll handle that too. But I don't believe she will. People who have a real case don't announce it in letters, they file paperwork." He looked at Cora directly. "You are not in serious danger here, Mrs. Halloran. You have rights and you have standing. Don't let grief masquerading as legal action frighten you off something that is working." Cora looked at him. "How did you know it was working?" He glanced at Wes, then back at her. "Because he came with you," he said simply. They rode back to the ranch in the afternoon with the cold, clear air that follows a storm, and everything looked sharp-edged and clean in the way the world only looks when weather has scoured it. They didn't talk much on the ride. They didn't need to. Some things between people develop their own kind of silence, not the silence of nothing to say, but the silence of two people who've said enough for now and are comfortable letting the rest arrive when it's ready. They were a mile from the ranch when Cora said, "He was right." Wes looked at her. "Beaumont," she said, "about not letting something that's working get frightened off." Wes said nothing. He waited. "I've been frightened since Daniel died," she said. "Not of any one thing, just running the calculation. Worst case always. What happens if this falls through? What happens if they don't want us? What happens next?" She looked at the road ahead. "I'm tired of running it." "Then stop," he said. "It's not that simple," she said. "It's not simple at all," he said. "But you're the most capable person I've ever seen in a crisis, and I've never once seen you panic. So whatever you're afraid of, I don't think it's really the worst case." He paused. "I think you're afraid the good case is true, and you don't know yet how to live in it." She looked at him. He looked straight ahead. "Wes," she said. "Cora." That was surprisingly perceptive for a man who doesn't smile enough. He looked at her then, and the corner of his mouth moved further this time, far enough to be counted. "I'm working on it," he said. That evening, Nora asked at supper if they were going to stay. She asked it the way children ask the questions adults circle for weeks directly without preamble in the middle of eating her biscuit, looking at her mother with those gray eyes that missed nothing. "I think so," Cora said. Nora looked at Wes. "Are you going to let us—" "It's not a question of letting," Wes said. "You belong here." Nora considered this with the full seriousness she brought to all important questions. Then she looked at her biscuit, then back at Wes. "I asked Tom to teach me to tie a lasso," she said. "He said I had to ask you first." "You can learn to tie a lasso," Wes said. Nora nodded satisfied and went back to eating. Tom across the table was looking at his food with the expression of a man fighting very hard not to show anything on his face. Dell beside him was doing the same. Garth Pickett at the far end of the table said nothing. But he reached for the breadboard and passed it toward Nora's end of the table without being asked. The first time he'd passed anything in her direction in a month. Nora took a piece of bread. She didn't comment on it. She was 6 years old, and she understood the way children understand things they haven't been taught yet, that some moments are best received quietly. Later, when the men had gone and Nora was asleep and the cookhouse was down to the fire and the last of the evening's warmth, Wes came back. He stood in the doorway. He looked at Cora at the stove, banking the fire for the night. "I should have said this earlier," he said. "Maybe weeks ago." She turned and looked at him. "I know what I sent for," he said. "I know what I got instead." He moved into the kitchen and stopped on the other side of the work table, the table that had been between them for every important conversation they'd ever had, which he now recognized had never been a barrier. It had been a place where things got made. "I got a woman who feeds 16 men and catches suppliers cheating and finds legal documents in old folders and runs countermoves on land fraud in the middle of blizzards and keeps people safe and—" He stopped, looked at her, "and makes a pie crust with cinnamon in it that made a hard man remember his mother." Cora stood very still. "I didn't know I needed any of that," he said. "I just thought I needed a cook." He looked at her the way he'd been looking at things all month, with full attention without flinching. "I was wrong about what I needed. I was wrong about what this place needed. And I was wrong—" He stopped one more time. Said the last part carefully, the way he said all the things that mattered. "I was wrong to take 3 weeks to tell you that this isn't a trial anymore. It hasn't been a trial for a very long time." Cora looked at him across the work table. She thought about everything: the stagecoach pulling away Nora's hand in hers, the flour sack in the storage shed, the sourdough starter coming back to life, the storm and the letter, and the old man with the tin box, and the lawyer who said "you belong here," and the road back with the clean cold air after weather. She thought about what Dell had said. "He doesn't know what he's got here," and what she'd said back. "He's a smart man. He'll figure it out." He had. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "I've known for a while," she said. "I was waiting for you to catch up." Something broke open in his expression, not dramatically, not the way things break in stories, quietly. The way ice shifts on a river in early spring, 1 degree of warmth at a time, until the whole surface changes, and you can't point to the moment it happened, but you know it has. He reached across the work table and put his hand over hers. She turned her hand over and let him. They stayed like that for a moment, 2 people on either side of an oak table that had seen a month of hard work and good food and crisis and honesty, and didn't say anything else. They didn't need to. The east pasture stayed. The loan went through. Rooney's shoulder healed in 14 days, which Dr. Fielding said was faster than it should have been, and which Rooney attributed with complete sincerity to Cora's biscuits. Tom learned that a 6-year-old with enough determination could in fact learn to tie a passable lasso, though it took 4 weeks and the sacrifice of 3 of his best ropes. Mrs. Halloran of Galveston received Beaumont's letter and did not write again. Garth Pickett ate everything Cora made and complained about none of it, which on Roan Fork Ranch was the strongest endorsement available. And Cora Halloran, who had arrived on a stagecoach with 2 carpetbags and a daughter and nothing left to lose, stayed. She stayed not because she had nowhere else to go. She stayed because she had, for the first time in 3 years, somewhere worth staying for. A kitchen that was hers. A ranch that needed what she was. A man who had looked at everything she actually was, not the version women were supposed to present, softened and reduced, and made small enough to be comfortable, and said, "I need exactly this." She fed 16 men every morning and every evening, and she was 3 days ahead always. She read the weather and adjusted the menu and caught the problems before they became crises, and kept the sourdough starter alive through 2 more winters. And sometimes in the evenings when the kitchen was quiet, and Nora was reading her McGuffey reader in the lamplight and the fire was steady. Wes Tate sat at the end of the work table with his coffee and his own quiet, and neither of them said much of anything. They didn't need to say much. The kitchen said it for them in bread and fire, and the smell of cinnamon, and the sound of a child reading aloud, and the accumulated warmth of a place that had been brought back to life by someone who knew exactly how to do it. Roan Fork Ranch had needed a cook. What it got was the woman who made it a home. And that was the whole of it, and it was enough, and it was everything.